At my parents' 40th anniversary, I realized I wasn't family anymore. I remember standing at the entrance of the ballroom, adjusting the sleeve of my navy dress, the one I bought just for tonight, thinking this would be a celebration of everything we had built together, 40 years of marriage, decades of memories, a family that was supposed to mean something. And then I looked down at the small cream-colored card pinned neatly to my chest and felt something shift inside me, because instead of my name, it read, Family Obligation, written in elegant gold script. As if humiliation could be dressed up to look polite, I didn't react. I didn't pull it off. I simply smoothed the fabric and walked inside, the chandeliers casting a warm glow across the room, glasses clinking, laughter echoing. People embracing like this was a night of love and gratitude, and for a moment I told myself it had to be a mistake, that someone had mixed up the tags, that any second my son Daniel would notice and fix it, but he didn't. He was across the room with Emily, smiling, relaxed, as if everything was exactly as it should be. I took my seat at the table assigned to me, tucked near the back, far from the stage, far from the center, far from where family usually belongs, and I folded my hands in my lap, steady, composed, listening as conversations flowed around me without ever quite including me. Then the host stepped up to the microphone, tapping it lightly, calling for attention, and with a laugh that carried too easily across the room, he said, "And tonight, we also have someone very special here, the woman who just can't seem to let go of the past." And I felt the pause, the subtle shift, the way eyes began to turn toward me, and then the laughter followed, light at first, then growing, filling the space between us like something tangible, and I lifted my gaze slowly, not searching for approval, not asking for explanation, just observing, because there, in the front row, my son was smiling, not uncomfortable, not confused, just smiling as if the moment belonged to him too. And that was when everything became clear, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet, undeniable certainty, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. I sat there for a few more minutes, long enough to notice the details I had ignored before, the way no one had saved me a place near them, the way my presence felt more like an obligation than a welcome, the way the night had been carefully arranged without me in mind. And then, without drawing attention, without interrupting the celebration, I stood up, smoothed my dress one last time, and walked out of the room. Because I didn't need to ask what had just happened, and I didn't need to stay to be reminded. Again, I walked out into the cool night air without looking back, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind me as the ballroom doors closed. And for a moment, I just stood there on the sidewalk, feeling the quiet settle around me in a way that felt more honest than anything inside that room. My heels clicking softly against the pavement as I made my way to my car, each step measured, controlled, as if I had already decided something important and my body was simply catching up. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I just drove home with both hands steady on the wheel, watching the city lights blur past, thinking about how easily a lifetime of belonging can be reduced to a single label pinned to your chest. When I reached my house, the porch light was still on, the same warm glow that had greeted my family for years, and I paused at the door, keys in hand, remembering all the times I had stood there waiting for Daniel to come home, waiting for holidays, for birthdays, for moments that felt like they mattered. And then I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The silence inside was different, not empty, not lonely, just clear, like something had been stripped away, and what remained was finally honest. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter and took off my shoes, placing them neatly by the door out of habit. Even now, even after everything, I still moved through my home with care, with intention. I walked into the living room and sat down slowly, my eyes drifting to the framed photographs on the mantel. Daniel as a little boy with scraped knees and bright eyes. The day he graduated college. The first house I helped him buy. Every image a reminder of the years I had given without hesitation, without calculation, and I let myself sit there, not to mourn, but to understand, because the truth was not sudden. It had been building quietly, in missed phone calls, in conversations that felt shorter each time, in the way Emily would smile without warmth, in the way decisions were made without me. Tonight had not created anything new. It had simply made everything visible. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside me, Not pain, not anger, but clarity, the kind that does not demand a reaction, the kind that does not need to be explained. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts, stopping at a name I had not called in years, my attorney, the one who had helped me put everything in order after my husband passed. I stared at the screen for a moment, my thumb hovering just above the call button, and then I lowered my hand. Not yet, I thought, because this was not about reacting to tonight. This was about acknowledging everything that had led to it. I stood up and walked upstairs, each step quiet, deliberate. As I entered my bedroom and opened a closet, my gaze settling on a small locked box on the top shelf, the one that held documents, records, decisions made long ago with trust and love. I reached up and took it down, holding it carefully, as if it contained something fragile. But I knew better now. It was not fragile at all. It was power, and for the first time in a very long time, I understood exactly what that meant. I sat on the edge of the bed with the box resting in my hands, my fingers tracing the smooth surface as if I could feel the years inside it. Not just documents, but decisions, trust, promises made when I still believed that family meant something permanent. I opened it slowly and lifted the first folder, the one labeled in my husband's handwriting, neat and steady, a detail that used to comfort me. And I read through the pages without rushing, every line familiar, every clause written to protect, to provide, to ensure that what we built would remain in the right hands. I remember the day we signed those papers, sitting across from our attorney, Daniel. Beside us, younger then, attentive, grateful, he had squeezed my hand and said he would always take care of me, that I would never have to worry, and I had believed him without hesitation, because that is what mothers do. They believe in the version of their children that once needed them, not the version that learns to live without them. I set the folder down and picked up another, this one more recent. Updates I had made after my husband passed, adjustments meant to simplify things, to make life easier for Daniel and Emily. I had transferred certain accounts, added their names where I thought it made sense, thinking it was generosity, thinking it was trust, and now, sitting there in the quiet of my room, I saw it differently, not as a mistake, but as a pattern, a slow shift of control that I had allowed without question. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street, the same street where Daniel learned to ride his bike, where I had stood for hours teaching him balance, letting go only when I knew he could keep himself steady, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I had forgotten to do the same for myself. I had kept holding on, kept giving. Long after it stopped being returned, I went back to the bed and carefully reorganized the documents, separating what was mine from what I had already given, the lines becoming clearer with each page, not emotional lines, not dramatic, just practical, necessary. I picked up my phone again, and this time, I did not hesitate. I called my attorney and waited as it rang, listening to the quiet hum of the house around me. When he answered, his voice familiar and calm, I spoke just as steadily. I told him I needed to review everything, every account, every transfer, every document with my name on it. There was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion, not surprise, just understanding. As if he had been waiting for this call longer than I had realized. We scheduled a meeting for the morning, and when I ended the call, I felt something settle into place, not relief, not satisfaction, but certainty. I closed the box and placed it beside me. No longer something I avoided, no longer something tied to sentiment, but something clear, something defined. I turned off the light and lay down, staring at the ceiling, not replaying the night, not questioning what had happened, because I already knew. Tonight was not the beginning of anything. It was the end of something I had been holding on to for far too long, and for the first time, that did not feel like a loss. I woke up before the sun rose, not because I could not sleep, but because my mind had already settled into a kind of quiet focus that did not allow for restlessness. The house was still, the kind of stillness that feels intentional rather than empty, and I moved through it slowly, making coffee the same way I had for years, measuring, pouring, waiting. Small rituals that once felt like preparation for a day filled with family, but now simply marked the beginning of something else, something clearer. I sat at the kitchen table with my cup in both hands, watching the light begin to stretch across the floor, and I thought about how many mornings I had spent here planning for others, thinking about what Daniel needed, what Emily might expect, how to make things easier, smoother, better for everyone else. And it occurred to me that I had not asked myself what I needed in a very long time, not in any real way. I finished my coffee and stood, rinsing the cup and placing it carefully in the sink, every movement deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. I got dressed in a simple gray suit, the one I wore for important meetings, and as I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not see the woman from last night. I saw someone who understood the situation without needing to explain it, someone who did not require permission to act. The drive to my attorney's office was quiet, the road still half empty, the early morning light reflecting off storefront windows, and I kept my attention forward, not drifting into memories, not replaying conversations, just moving toward what needed to be done. When I arrived, he was already there, waiting in his office with a folder open on his desk, and when I sat across from him, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I simply told him I wanted everything reviewed and restructured, every account, every property, every document that tied my name to anyone else. I watched as he nodded, not surprised, just attentive, asking careful, precise questions, and I answered each one without hesitation. Because the answers were no longer complicated, they were not tied to emotion or history. They were practical, necessary. I explained which assets had been transferred, which ones I wanted returned to my sole control, which arrangements needed to be revoked, and as we spoke, I could feel the weight of years lifting, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like something being untangled piece by piece. He outlined the steps, the timelines, the legal adjustments required, and I listened, absorbing each detail, understanding exactly what would happen next. When we finished, he closed the folder and looked at me for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but I simply nodded. Because there was nothing left to explain, I stood up, thanked him, and walked out of the office with the same steady pace I had carried all morning. Outside, the city was fully awake now, cars moving, people walking, life continuing as it always does, and I paused for a brief moment before getting into my car, not to reflect, not to question, but to acknowledge that something had shifted completely, not because of what had been done to me, but because of what I had chosen to do in response. I drove home without turning on the radio, the silence no longer heavy, just present, and when I pulled into my driveway, I noticed the mailbox slightly open, a small detail I might have ignored before, but now I stepped out and checked it, sorting through the envelopes with calm precision, bills, advertisements, and one letter addressed in a familiar handwriting, Daniel's. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight, not physical, but symbolic, and then I walked inside, placing it on the kitchen counter without opening it, because whatever it contained, apology or explanation, it no longer had the power to change what had already been decided. I left the letter where it was and moved through the house as if it did not exist, not out of avoidance but out of clarity, because I already understood what it would say. Apologies formed too late, explanations shaped by convenience, words that would have mattered once, but no longer held any weight. I opened the refrigerator and took out a carton of milk, pouring a small amount into a glass without thinking, then setting it back untouched. Even the smallest habits felt different now, as if they belonged to a version of me that no longer fit. I walked back into the living room and sat down, my eyes drifting again to the photographs. But this time I did not linger on them. I did not trace the edges of memory or search for meaning. I simply observed them as they were, moments frozen in time that no longer defined my present. My phone buzzed softly on the table beside me, the screen lighting up with Daniel's name. I watched it for a moment, letting it ring, not with anger, not with hesitation, but with a calm understanding that answering would not change anything. When it stopped, another message followed almost immediately, then another, each one arriving with a quiet insistence that felt familiar, the same pattern, reaching out only when something shifted, only when something was at risk. I turned the phone face down and stood up, walking toward the window, the afternoon light now filling the room completely, bright, clear, revealing everything without distortion, and I realized that for years I had been adjusting my view to fit what others needed, softening edges, ignoring inconsistencies, telling myself that certain behaviors were temporary, that people would remember who I was to them, that love would eventually balance everything out, but it never had, and now, standing there, I did not feel bitterness about that. only a quiet acceptance that it had always been this way. I returned to the kitchen and picked up the letter, holding it between my fingers for a moment before placing it into a drawer without opening it. Not as a symbolic gesture, not as a statement, just a decision, simple and complete. My phone buzzed again, longer this time, the vibration steady against the surface of the table, and I walked over to it. Picking it up, not to answer, but to silence it, the screen filled with missed calls and messages, short lines of concern, confusion, urgency. I read none of them fully. I did not need to, because the tone was already clear. Something had changed on their end. Something they had relied on was no longer certain, and that uncertainty had found its way back to me. I set the phone down once more and moved toward the hallway, pausing briefly at the base of the stairs. The house felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because my place within it had shifted. It was no longer a space I maintained for others, no longer a place tied to expectations or roles. It was simply mine, and that realization settled into me with a quiet strength. I walked upstairs and opened the small desk drawer in my bedroom, taking out a notepad and pen, sitting down, and writing a few short lines, not emotional, not detailed, just clear instructions, accounts to review, appointments to confirm, decisions to finalize, each word deliberate, each line a step forward. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked at the page, not with doubt, not with second thoughts, but with the steady understanding that everything I was doing now was not a reaction to one night. It was the completion of something that had been unfolding for years, and somewhere across town. Without realizing it yet, Daniel and Emily were beginning to feel the first signs of what that completion truly meant. The next morning began without interruption, but by mid-afternoon the silence shifted, not inside my house, but somewhere beyond it. I could feel it in the way my phone remained still for hours, and then suddenly came alive again, not with one call, but several, spaced too closely together to be coincidence. I watched the screen light up from across the room, Daniel's name appearing again and again, followed by a message notification, then another, and I did not rush to it. I finished what I was doing first, folding a set of linens and placing them neatly into the closet, closing the door with the same calm precision I had carried all week. When I finally picked up the phone, I did not open the messages. I simply noticed the pattern, the timing, the urgency that had not been there before. Something had reached them, something had shifted, and I already knew what it was. Earlier that day my attorney had begun the process. Quiet notifications sent, access points adjusted, accounts reviewed and flagged. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just a series of controlled changes that would not make sense at first glance, but would become very clear once they tried to use what was no longer available to them. I set the phone back down and walked into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I leaned against the counter, remembering how many times I had stepped in to solve problems before they even reached Daniel, how often I had smoothed over complications so that his life would remain easy, uninterrupted, and I wondered, not with bitterness but with curiosity, how he would handle things now that there was no one quietly fixing them in the background. The phone buzzed again, longer this time, and I let it continue for a few seconds before silencing it, not rejecting, not accepting, just ending the sound. Because the noise itself was no longer something I needed to respond to, I walked into the living room and sat down, the afternoon light stretching across the floor, steady and unchanged, and for a moment I allowed myself to think back, not to last night, but to years before, small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. The first time Emily redirected a conversation away from me, the first time Daniel agreed without hesitation, the quiet decisions made without my input, the gradual shift from inclusion to distance. It had not happened all at once. It never does. It happens in layers, in small adjustments that seem harmless until they are not. And now, sitting there, I could see the full pattern, clear and complete. My phone vibrated once more, and this time I picked it up, not to read, but to turn it off completely. Pressing the button and watching the screen go dark, the room falling into a deeper kind of quiet, not empty, not heavy, just resolved. I placed the phone on the table and leaned back in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because whatever was happening on the other side of those missed calls, whatever questions were being asked, whatever confusion was beginning to form, it no longer required my participation. It would unfold on its own, piece by piece, just as everything else had. And, for the first time, I was not waiting to see what they would do next. I already knew what I would do. By the second day, the calls stopped coming in waves and started arriving with purpose, spaced out, deliberate, as if someone on the other end was trying to think before reaching out again. And that was when I turned my phone back on, not out of curiosity, but because I knew the timing mattered now. I sat at the kitchen table with the device in front of me, letting the screen light up slowly, revealing the missed calls. The messages stacked one after another, and I opened the first one, not rushing, not bracing, just reading. Daniel's words were careful at first, asking if everything was all right, mentioning that something seemed off with the accounts, that there might be a mistake. The next message came with less certainty, asking if I had spoken to the bank, if I knew why certain transfers were no longer accessible. And by the third, the tone shifted again, less composed, more urgent, asking me to call him back as soon as possible. I set the phone down after reading only those three, because the rest did not need to be read to be understood. I could already see the progression, confusion turning into concern, concern beginning to edge into panic. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where everything continued as usual. Neighbors walking their dogs, cars passing by, nothing in the outside world reflecting what was unfolding elsewhere. And I thought about how often I had protected that sense of normalcy for Daniel, how many times I had stepped in before anything could become complicated, ensuring that his life moved forward without disruption. And now, for the first time, I was not doing that. I was allowing the natural consequences to surface. I returned to the table and picked up the phone again, opening another message, this one from Emily, shorter, more direct, asking if I had made changes to the accounts, followed by a second message just minutes later, suggesting that there must have been some kind of misunderstanding. And I noticed the wording, the careful attempt to soften the situation, to frame it as something accidental, something that could be easily corrected, and I recognized it immediately. The same tone she had used in conversations for years, the same quiet control, the same assumption that things would be adjusted back into place once addressed. I placed the phone down once more and leaned back in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because this time, there would be no adjustment. No quiet correction behind the scenes. The changes that had been set in motion were not mistakes, they were decisions, and they would continue forward exactly as planned. The phone buzzed again, and this time I let it ring longer before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted the moment to settle into its proper place. When I finally pressed the button and lifted the phone to my ear, I did not speak first, I listened. Daniel's voice came through immediately, tight, controlled, but strained beneath the surface. He asked what was going on, why he could not access certain funds, why the bank had informed him of restrictions he did not understand, and I let him finish without interruption, without reacting to the urgency in his tone. When he paused, waiting for an explanation, I spoke calmly, my voice steady, measured, as if I were discussing something entirely routine. I told him that everything was exactly as it should be, that there was no mistake, no misunderstanding, only a correction of ownership. And on the other end of the line, there was silence, not brief, not uncertain, but complete, the kind of silence that comes when someone realizes that the situation is no longer under their control. And I held that silence without filling it, without softening it, because for the first time, it did not belong to me to resolve. The silence on the line did not break immediately. It stretched just long enough to settle into something real, something neither of us could ignore. And when Daniel finally spoke again, his voice had changed. The certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain. He asked what I meant by correction, as if the word itself might still be flexible, as if it could be shaped into something temporary. And I remained still, holding the phone gently against my ear, not shifting, not filling the space with anything unnecessary. I explained that the accounts had been reviewed and adjusted to reflect their original ownership, that anything transferred under assumptions that no longer held had been returned, and I kept my tone even, not cold, not warm, just clear, because clarity does not require emotion, it only requires truth. On the other end I could hear him exhale slowly, the kind of breath that carries more weight than words. And then came the questions, not loud, not aggressive, but layered. Why now? Why like this? Why without talking to him first? And I listened to each one without interrupting, without reacting, because I recognized them for what they were, not questions seeking understanding, but attempts to restore something that had already shifted beyond reach. I stood up and walked slowly toward the window as he spoke, my reflection faintly visible in the glass, steady, unchanged, and I realized that this moment was not about explaining myself. It was about allowing him to understand what had already been decided. When he paused again, waiting, I told him that conversations require mutual respect, and that respect cannot exist in a space where someone has already been reduced to an obligation. I did not raise my voice. I did not repeat the details of that night. I did not need to, because the truth of it was already present, woven into everything that had followed. There was another silence after that, heavier this time, more grounded. And then Emily's voice entered the line, not directly, but close enough that I could hear her speaking to him, asking what I had said, her tone controlled, measured, still attempting to navigate the situation as something that could be redirected. And for a brief moment I closed my eyes, not in frustration, not in pain, but in recognition, because nothing about this was new. It was simply clearer now. I returned my attention to the call and spoke one final time, not to argue, not to defend, but to define. I told them that there would be no reversal, no adjustment, no discussion about restoring what had been changed, that everything moving forward would remain exactly as it was now. And I let the words settle without adding anything more. On the other end, the reaction was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, the kind of silence that carries the weight of realization, and I did not wait for a response. I ended the call gently, placing the phone back on the table with the same calm precision I had carried through every step of this process. The house remained quiet around me, unchanged, steady, and I stood there for a moment, not reflecting on what had just happened, not questioning whether it was right or wrong, because that had already been decided long before this call. I turned away from the table and walked toward the hallway, my steps even, unhurried, because for the first time, nothing was pulling me back, nothing was waiting to be fixed, everything was exactly where it needed to be, and whatever came next would no longer be something I had to manage for anyone else. The house remained quiet long after the call ended, not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that settles in after something has finally been resolved. I walked slowly back into the living room and sat down, my hands resting loosely in my lap, not tense, not uncertain, just still, and I let the moment pass without trying to fill it. Outside, the late afternoon light had begun to soften, stretching longer across the floor, changing the shape of the room in small, almost unnoticeable ways, and I watched it as if it were something new, something I had not taken the time to see before. My phone remained on the table, quiet now, no longer vibrating, no longer demanding attention, and I did not reach for it, because whatever needed to be said had already been said, whatever needed to change had already been set in motion. I stood up after a while and walked toward the mantel, my eyes moving across the photographs once more, but this time there was no pull to revisit them, no need to hold on to what they represented. I picked up one frame, a picture of Daniel when he was younger, smiling up at me with the kind of trust that only exists before life begins to shift, and I looked at it for a few seconds before placing it back exactly where it had been, not as a rejection, not as a loss, just as an acknowledgement that time moves forward whether we are ready or not. I turned away and walked into the kitchen, pouring another glass of water, taking a slow sip as I leaned against the counter, my reflection faint in the window, steady and unchanged, and I realized that nothing about who I was had been diminished by what had happened. If anything, it had become clearer, more defined. The roles I had carried for so long no longer blurred the edges of who I needed to be now. I set the glass down and walked toward the front door, opening it and stepping outside, the air cooler now, carrying the quiet sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening, and I stood there for a moment, not waiting, not expecting anything to follow, just present, just aware, because for years I had lived in anticipation of what others needed, what others might say, what others might take, and now there was nothing left to anticipate, only what I chose to do next. I stepped back inside and closed the door gently behind me, turning the lock with a soft, final click. And as I walked back into the house, I understood something with a certainty that did not require explanation. I had not lost anything that night. Not really. What I had lost had been fading long before that, piece by piece, unnoticed until it was gone, and what remained now was not emptiness. It was space, space to move without adjustment, space to exist without being reduced to something smaller. I turned off the lights one by one as I moved through the rooms, not out of routine, but out of intention, each switch marking the end of something that no longer needed to be carried forward. And when I finally reached my bedroom, I paused at the doorway for just a second before stepping inside, not looking back, not reconsidering, because there was nothing behind me that required it. And as the room settled into darkness, I allowed myself a single, quiet thought, not spoken aloud, not shared, just held. Respect is not something you ask for. It is something that disappears the moment you are willing to accept less. And once it is gone, there is no reason to stay where it was lost.